geographic area of the U.S. was best for the sport?
To answer that question, I guess you'd have to go back through the decades and kind of snowball them and put them on top of one another. The Midwest, to me, was the premier spot for a long, long period in time. And then the Carolinas come into play real big. But up where Bruno was from, Vince Sr., and I think you probably know his father too, right?
Just McMahon, he passed away the year that I came in, just before I came into the business.
But that area for a long, long time was considered the best territory in wrespling.
If I may, I'll tell you why I think it was the best, in my opinion. I'll tell you why. For the talent, especially for the top talent, I'll tell you why I think the Northeast was the absolute best. A couple of reasons. One is we had more major arenas than any other territory around the country, because you had not only Madison Square Garden, but you had Nassau Coliseum, which was another 20,000 people. You had Pittsburgh, it was 19,000, Baltimore 18,000, Washington 24,000, Philadelphia 23,000. You had Providence 19,000, Boston, all those places. So that's number one. You had enormous arenas, and so it was a good place if you got the opportunity to be a main eventer or to be in a card. The other thing was very advantageous to us that I don't think other territories had this advantage. And that was that when you're in New York, you got more publicity than anybody else in any territory. Let me show you, for example, for me. They used to come up with about 9 different magazines, wrestling magazines. And because in New York in the Garden, I used to be on the cover in the 60s of about 6, 7 of them. And those magazines went everywhere. And so that publicized you, which was an advantage which a lot of other fellas in different territories didn't have that advantage. For example, when I would leave New York, let's say like for example, Ralph Shires would call Vince McMahon for me to come out there to work, to wrestle with Stevens 2 or 3 times. I'd go strictly as the main eventer, you know what I mean? When I went to Florida with Eddie Graham and Bill Watts, I went as the headliner. Anywhere I went from New York, I went as a main eventer, whether it was in California, when I went for Paul Bosch in Texas, or even in St. Louis with that always used to be on top. That was all because of the number one, the publicity you got out of there, and Madison Square Garden itself had its own broadcast, its own television that went all over the place. Whereas there were stars from other territories that were terrific, great stars, but yet if they came to New York, they were not big stars in New York, and they would not come in and just headline Madison Square Garden. They would be put on a card, because I remember, for example, and this is not a knock at all, but I remember, what's his name, Jim Crockett contacted McMahon because Flair was a big deal in the Carolinas, and he wanted to give some publicity there saying that he was in the Garden. Well, he did come in the Garden. I remember because I was wrestling Blackjack Mulligan on the main event, but he was wrestling a guy named Pete Sanchez in the preliminary, because Ric Flair was not known. You know what I mean? So that's why I say New York had the advantage, because you got much more publicity worldwide than any place else. Which I don't know if you agree with that,
yes,
Arlie, but that's in my opinion that was the thing about it.
That answer may serve as the answer to this next question. Bruno, why did you choose to make your respective territories your homes?
Why did I choose? Well, when I first, should I say, discovered or whatever the thing is, because I told you I was on a television show. I had been in Oklahoma City where I competed in North American Weightlifting Championships, and they had me on this TV show with a guy named Bob Prince, who was the voice of the Pittsburgh Pirates. He had seen me at the Y work out, and he was impressed with the kind of weights we were pushing. And when he had me on as a guest after that, it just happened that wasn't WWF at the time. It was known as Capital Wrestling. They had a live studio wrestling in Pittsburgh on an NBC affiliate. And the guy who represented them was a gentleman named Rudy Miller. He happened to come in the day before, which was on a Friday, for the Saturday live show. And I guess he was around looking at the TV, and he saw this. And when Bob Prince asked me about was I still wrestling, because he saw me up at the Pitt Fieldhouse a few times, and then he asked me about my weightlifting and this title I just won. Well, Rudy Miller went to the studio and he asked around if anybody knew who this kid Bruno Sammartino was, and a fellow by the name of John Carzonas that I went to high school with. He says, yeah, Bruno's a friend of mine, we live in the same street. He says, could you have him come over here next week? Point is that I met Rudy Miller. He asked me if I'd be interested in wrestling. They flew me to Washington, and that's how my beginning came in Washington, like that. Not that it was a choice of me. I didn't even know Terry. I didn't know anything about wrestling at the time. But that's how I got to choose New York.
But after you got your main event status, you could have gone anywhere. You stayed there, Lars. What was it about?
Well, no, I between titles, okay? Because I told you, after 8 years, I had it. I had it. I told McMahon, I says, I need a rest. I gotta go home. I was just starting. I was in bad shape. And during this time, after I rested for a good while, I was going to see this doctor, chiropractor, and other osteopath, trying to get, because I was in a lot of pain. And I started feeling better. Then I started taking shots, and I'd go sometimes in St. Louis. Then Dick the Bruiser and I then teamed up to like places like Indiana and Chicago and Milwaukee, and so I would go with him. But what I would do is wrestle maybe 3-4 days and then take off 4 or 5 days. If I went to Japan for 2 weeks, I would take off. So I loved the business all over again, because now I wasn't going in every day in pain.
Right.
And so I felt I loved the business all over again, and I really loved it like that. And the reason why, so I was working all different territories at that time. I was a lot of different places. For shots, not that I ever went to any territory and made it my home base.
Right.
I'd be home and I'd just get calls, and if I went to Tennessee for Nick Goulas for a couple of shows, or like I said, Paul Bosch in Houston, I'd go for. But and I loved it. And then when McMahon contacted me, because things were really slowing down in New York, and I didn't want no part of going back. Not to go back, go in for a shot here and there was great, but to go back in the way that I was before. And I got talked into it, because he said for 1 year until they got somebody else that could fit that role. And it's, the story, 1 year went to 2, 2 went to 3, on the 4th year I broke my neck.
Right. Harley?
I own you now.